Yep, good evening. So, yesterday we learned about what is Redux and how it works. We will see one example. We discussed what is state management, why we need state management, what are the various techniques of state management theoretically. We learned about application state, session state, cookies, and all this. Now, to work with Redux, as we already discussed in the last session, actually, without Redux, how to transport data, that is important actually. Suppose without Redux, what are the techniques we need to follow? I will use here, yeah. Generally, without Redux, usually how we transport the data from one component to another component. Generally, what we do is when we want to transport data from a component, actually, suppose you have a component and we need to transport data from one component to others. Usually, what we do is for every component, we can manage context. For every component, actually, we can manage context. It's a multi-level hierarchy, actually. Multi-level hierarchy means, so we have this component. From this component, data will be passed to this one. We need to pass data to that component. And from this component, again, data need to be passed to this. That means what happens? This is the parent component. It will have a context. Am I right? In that context, this component will work. And for this, we will have a context. And that context, this component will work. Am I right? That is the process. We need to carry data from one level to another, from that level to another. That is very lengthy process of transporting the data. Now, what is the point about Redux is centralize your data store. That means what you can do is instead of doing all this, you can centralize your data store. That means you can keep your data in one location. And you can make that available to all these components. That is what the point is. I told you now, we have single call, singleton mechanism. Yesterday we discussed that. That means, are you trying to maintain an object for every component to store its data? That is single call mechanism. If you are trying to maintain a single object for all the components where you can handle the data, that is singleton. Singleton. Services and these kind of state techniques all depend on singleton pattern only. They all depend on singleton pattern. Singleton pattern means, so one location you keep for the first request you create and the same you use for all. Every time we don't need to create. That is what actually the point. You keep updating that store. You keep updating that store. That means any component can modify and update it into the store. It will be available to others also. Any component can update into the store and it will be affected everywhere. That is the basic process of managing it, right? So when you are working with Redux, already we learned about use reducer. Na? I explained these terms. What are the basic terms? I hope this diagram I showed you already. So without Redux, we have a component, we have a data provider. The provider comes to another component. From there, data is transported to others. From there, data is transported. This is without Redux, how we manage. I already given one example on use reducer. So I I explained the scenario actually there. Same here, only the point is use reducer is an inbuilt hook which is available from React 16 and higher. And this is an external library. We can use this library and make more use of Redux store, right? Means state library. With Redux, how it works? With Redux, what we do is we will keep the component and we centralize all the data at one place. There will be a container where we keep the data. From there, it is provided to all. From where it is provided to everybody. That means the intention of Redux is to provide a single data store from where you can manage. Why it is called single source of truth? You remembered I told you this point. Single source of truth. In which concept I told you? I told you MVC architecture works, model view controller. Remember? In that we have model view controller. You remembered I told you a concept called change detection. Right? We learned all these things. I given FAQs also, go through them. Right? Many times people ask, so provide some interview questions and answers. Already we were providing for every level. Right? Till now, whatever FAQs I given in our topic wise, you put all them together. They are interview questions and answers. Understood? Right? That means if anybody have that time, so you please do this and give a PDF to me so that I can share with others. Means till now, all FAQs I given for every topic, frequently asked questions. If you keep all of them together, that is enough for preparing for interviews. Right? Those are all questions. So, single source of truth, why it is called single source of truth? Actually, whom we call single source of truth, actually this is the store. Actually, this is model. Understood? Model contains data, right? It contains data and it is called single source of truth. Why it is called single source of truth? Because it contains data and changes also. That means, so it will keep the data and it will keep the changes in the data. That means it contains information about what is previous and what is current. If previous value and current value is same, then what does it means? If it is same, that means no change detected. If previous value is not equal to current, current means change detected. Now it will update. Now, very important, actually, we learned several third-party tools like Formic and all. So without writing any functionality manually, how they are knowing that we are modifying? Actually, we are using handle change. Handle change is internally using this technique. What handle change is doing? It is identifying what is previous value and what is current value. If previous value and current value are both same, that means no change happened, no need to update. If current value and previous value are not same, some change detected and we have to update. That means when it will decide whether to update the store or not, when any change detected. That is what technically we call as single source of truth. We technically call this as single source of truth. So Redux follows, the state container follows this single source of truth. It refers to a model. Model means which contains data and which represents data and which contains the data changes. Actually, it generally uses an architecture like MVC, we call it as. That is model, view, and controller. In this, what is model? Model is nothing but it represents the data we are working with. It represents the data we are working with. It also contains data logic. It contains data validation rules. It contains data validation rules. It contains the data logic. It contains the data validation rules. And very important, it contains some metadata. Metadata actually identifies the changes and updates. It identifies whether the change occurred or not. That is the reason model is referred as single source of truth. Single source of truth. We generally call this as single source of truth. Wherever data is there, and if it is identifying the changes and updating the changes in the data, then it is referred as single source of truth. Right? That is what actually model changes, how the model changes happen and how it works usually. That is model. And generally view, we know. View is nothing but UI. So actually UI is nothing but it defines the views and partial views. Actually means components and pages are considered as views and partial views. And very important is actually view triggers the actions. It triggers the actions. That means from view, actions are triggered. That means from user interface, actions are triggered. Right? User interface. Now, where the actions are managed in controller. Controller means, so it comprises of actions to perform. Understood? This is actually called as, it is referred as subscriber. It is referred as subscriber, and it is a reducer. It is a reducer. I told you these points in use reducer concept, na? Right? What is reducer? What is subscriber? What is the role of reducer and what is the role of subscriber? Reducer, subscriber, actions. These words we learned. Already I posted, na? Where we have in our classroom. In which topic we discussed them? Reducer. Huh? Yeah. Here, where is it? Nested roads and all hooks. Huh? Use reducer hook. This is where we discuss, na? Right. So here I given you these points already. Right. Use a reducer. We have a dispatcher. That means what is reducer? Reducer defines actions to perform. It defines actions to perform. It defines the data to store. But data is not stored here, where the data is stored in the state. It is stored in the state, right? These terms already I explained. That means what reducer will do? Reducer predicts the action type and it returns relative data. It makes the data available across the requests. These points already we discussed. And you see, dispatcher also we learned. What dispatcher will do? It uses an observer pattern. It will send the message. It will perform the actions. These all things already I explained. Reducer, subscriber, So subscriber also I given a subscriber I given you in events concept. Na? In events I told you about the subscribers. So same thing, no change. Same concept works. What you have done here, same works. Only the point is we are doing this from an external library. Understood? We are doing the same thing with an external library. That's it. That what is the advantage of it? Will provide some more better tools for handling the data, monitoring the data, debugging the data, and managing the data. It will give better interface, the better platform, more features. But without that also we have done that, right? So this example already we tried, we already designed with the help of, right? Same concept actually. So here, that means where is data present? Data is present in model, right? From where the actions are triggered, UI. Who will manage the communication between UI and data? That is managed by controller. That means that is managed by whom? Reducer. That means what reducer will do? Reducer identifies what is the action asked. It will collect the data and it will send the data into the store. That means actually controller, it handles the overall communication. Communication between whom? Between model and view. We will implement this in an example which you already designed. Have you designed a shopping cart like example with TypeScript? You done it? Anybody done that? We already designed a shopping cart like thing in JavaScript. Have you designed that in TypeScript? Anybody done that? Right? Good. So if you successfully achieved it, who is this? Roja Mishra. Have you successfully achieved the complete functionality? Right? So if you have done that, you have to do it. I will not again show all that process here. Time waste, right? You have to do by yourself now, right? I will just give you the logic how to implement. You do it in that project, in that shopping cart application. Design the shopping cart application that I already showed you in JavaScript, right? That means React with JavaScript. I will just give you the process. You have to implement it. I am not going to design again all of that. You have to do it now, right? By using an external library, you have to do it. Okay. The same concept. If you feel any difficulty, I will check, right? Any problem, because now how to manage this? That means where we will use the state in our project. You see, where we do is, if you designed the shopping example, in that shopping example, what we done? In the shopping example, we created a menu, am I right? And we added here all the products related details are present. We can have all the products related details displayed here, right? And here we have a menu where user can select category, am I right? User can choose a category like jewelry or other categories user can select, like electronics. So like jewelry, men's, women's clothing, right? So women's, all this you can. Now here we given every product have an add to cart button, am I right? Add to cart button. So already some people have done this example successfully. I asked you to try them. In the doubt session also we have seen, right? And important. Now, previously what we are doing, this information we are storing in a general state, right? That means when user clicks add to cart, I need two details. Understood? What are the two details? I want to maintain separate cart items. It is an collection. Am I right? I need to create cart count. Understood? Cart count. And very important, cart count is number. It is a number. Cart count is a number. These two details I need to maintain in a store. These two details I need to maintain in a store. Why to maintain in a store? Because I need to display anywhere in my page. That means I need to display how many items are there in the cart. How many items are there in the cart? That means here I want the count. Understood? And when user clicks on it, all the items must be displayed. You can design a pop-up. In a pop-up, you can show those items, dialogues. We have React Material UI dialogues now. You can use them. That means what you have to do is you need to use a pop-up. By using the pop-up, you can display these cart items. Cart items you can show anywhere you want. A table, it contains the list of items that you added in the cart. Now, where to maintain all these details? You have to maintain all these details in a store, right? What is the purpose of keeping these details in the store? Until he sign out, right? These details will be kept. From any page he wants, he can go back to cart and he can see what items are there in the cart. Because he will be searching for various categories products. He will be switching between so many interfaces. But finally, cart items, they must be stable. They must be stored and they must be there until he signed out. Right? If you want to store them after sign out also, then what you have to do? Only one thing extra. From this store, you can send into backend database now. Am I right? You can send it to backend database. If you send it to backend database, it will be permanent. Right? If you don't want to send it to the database and store, we want to maintain a temporary cart items. Until he sign out, cart items should be there. Once he signed out successfully, those cart items are deleted. That means the store is deleted. Once he signed out, the store is deleted. We need to manage empty, right? So that means now we have a lot of things to manage. But concept is very simple actually. Here, what is the subscriber? That means here, what are the actions to perform? According to our concept, what we have to do is, we need the options here. See, we have to write logic on add to cart button click. When add to cart button click happen, that means what it will do? This is nothing but, this is referring to action. Am I right? What is the action? Action is add to cart click. Add to cart click is the action. It is triggered from the UI. When add to cart click is triggered from the UI, what we have to do? We have to collect this product related details. We have to collect that product related details and we need to store in this collection. Understood? That means on the button click, it has to carry some data. What is the data? Product related information, and it should store in the store. It will store in the Redux store. That is actually called, that means what it is sending? The product details. The product details, the product related information is sent to the store. This is called payload. This is called payload. That means in Redux, you have an action and we have a payload. What is action? Action indicates when to send the data. Action indicates when to send the data. What is payload? Payload indicates what data to be sent. That means when to store the data, when to update the data. Storing is managed by action, right? Action defines when to store the data. So what is the action? Action is simple. What is the action? So here action is what? Add to cart click. Am I right? That is the action. What is the payload? Product details. That means the product information must be carried, right? That means in Redux store, you will have two basic points. One is the action, another one is the payload. That means action indicates when to send the data to store, and payload refers what data to be sent into the store, when to send, what to send. That is actually the basic architecture generally. That is the basic architecture. That means in the Redux terminology, you will have these terms, which already we learned. State, we know state. We already know store. We just seen actions, right? And reducer is nothing but it identifies the changes in the data and updates the changes. Reducer is for identifying and updating the changes. And here you don't need other, you need payload. Payload is nothing but what data need to be stored. Single source of truth is nothing but who is single source of truth here? The data container. This state container is single source of truth, right? You need to just understand two basic things. What are those two basic things? One is what is action and what is payload. And one more you need now. If any change happening, that means this cart count will be updating now. Whenever a new record is added, the count of the cart will be updated. That is managed by reducer. Understood? That is managed by reducer. What is the role of reducer? Reducer identifies the changes. It identifies the changes and updates the changes. So action defines when to perform. Payload defines what to store. Reducer specifies when to update. That means it identifies the changes and updates the changes. That is reducer actually. That is how it works. So you need to know the basic infrastructure. This is how actually it works. That means we have state. From UI, we trigger the actions. That's not what I have told you. From UI, user interface, we trigger the action. When trigger the action, it will come to reducer. Reducer is your controller. It identifies the changes and update the changes into the store. This store is kept into the state. That means it will store the data and make the data available to your UI. Any component can access the data and do. Here, many times in interviews, they may ask consumer provider. I hope already I told you. We discussed about distributed computing. I explained. In distributed computing, I told you about service provider and service consumer. Who is service provider? Who is sending the data? Who is service consumer? Who is using the data? Here the service provider is state. The consumer is component. Understood? That means UI components. That is where we are using the data. From where the data is coming, that is coming from state. Right? This is the basic action. That means now according to our project, we have to manage this. But you have to design the project. I will not do again. I will just give you the logic part. You implement that logic in that project. Because already that project we designed in JavaScript. So means I designed shopping cart, filtering, add to cart, everything. So in that you have to implement these concepts. So How to do that? I will show you the process. I will give you the sample code. You just try to implement that in that application, because you need to redesign that complete application in TypeScript. Okay, so you know how to design, no need to worry, because already you learned fake store. Same, everything you have to replicate into this. Now, what is the user interface? How to handle the user interface in our project? Actually, the concept is nothing but what is our logic implementation here? User clicks on add to cart. Okay, this is already there in your project. User clicks on add to cart. We have to click on add to cart. When user clicks on add to cart, what should happen? So that means it should collect the product details. Understood? You have to collect the product details and store in Redux store. Understood? Store in Redux store. That means when add to cart is there, collect the product details and store in the Redux store. And what we have to do is, so we have to assign to cart items. Cart items are a collection. You have to store that into the cart items, and we need to bring that and display in UI. We need to bring that and display in the UI. So you can say bind to UI. Those cart items you need to bind to UI. This is the work you have to do. So that means you need to define these things. You have to handle this approach. For that, whatever logic is required, I will give you the logic. I will just explain. So you have to do, right? Why? Because again, redesigning that already created example is lengthy process. You do it because already we learned it. No need to explain 2-3 times again, right? So what you do is you design that shopping cart example, in that you implement. For that, first what you have to do, I will give the steps. You have to do that. In the first step 1 is install Redux toolkit. You install Redux toolkit for your project. Install Redux toolkit for your project. So for that, you just need to follow this command to install. npm install. You can go to the official website. There you will get that command. Just you have to use this ReactJS toolkit and React Redux. So we have to install the Redux toolkit. So and save. This is for your project. So actually you can do that while creating the project itself. So, but already we created a project, we can add Redux in this, right? So first step, you have to create the Redux toolkit. Okay. Let's do this. Means I'm just showing you the process. You have to finish this work. I will just give you the logic part. Okay. I will explain the logic part. You implement. Okay. Right. Let's go in our ReactJS project. We have to use this. I'm just using yeah. So npm install Redux toolkit and save. Remember, Redux is not only for React. I already told you. So in Angular, everywhere concept is same. Only the way of writing your events, collecting the data will be different. Rest of other things will be same, no change. That means you know how to use Redux in your one technology, you can implement in others also. Only the point is there the way of writing events, triggering the actions, collecting the data from the actions, updating the store. These locations will change. The syntactical approach will change. Rest of concept logic is same. So you have to first install this. right? Once the Redux store is installed, you can do one more that is in the debugger. You have to do it. Debugger means actually you have Chrome debugging tools, na? Google Chrome. We have Chrome App Store, right? You can add a plugin into that Chrome App Store. So that is good for verifying Redux store actually. Chrome:/apps. In that Chrome App Store, Web Store, you can go to Web Store at the bottom. It will be there. And here you can say Redux. The Redux developer kit will be there. Dev tools will be there. Huh? You can download this Redux Dev tools. Redux Dev tools. So this Redux Dev tools are nothing but if you add this to your browser, you can easily monitor what is the data stored inside a state, what values are defined in the state. You can easily monitor them, right? What you need to do is you can download this and add to Chrome. You add to Chrome, add extension. Okay. So what is advantage of this is, yeah. So the Redux store is added into it, right? Done. Once the Redux store is added, then what you can do is we can easily monitor the state. That means in your browser, you can open the Redux toolkit. When you are using Redux in your project, you can use it. Okay. It will be available in your options. In your options, it will be available. You can use it, right? Currently, I don't have here extension. Anything running, you can see Redux Dev Tools will be there. So this is the extension. Huh? This will automatically work if your application is using a state, Redux state. Then you can see what is stored in the state, what is present in the state, how it is changing. All you can monitor as a developer, right? For that, you can add this plugin, Redux Dev Tools, you can use for your Chrome. So first step is install this, and another option is better install Redux Dev Tools for your browser, for Chrome, for your Chrome browser. So you can do that, right? You can search and you can install this for your browser. That is the first step you have to do. Next step, in order to create and configure the store, actually second step is you have to create a slicer. Create a Redux slicer. Create a Redux slicer. First, you have to create one Redux slicer. What is our current requirement in the shopping site? We have to write a logic for add to cart click. On add to cart click, collect the cart name, cart item details, product details, and store in the data. And two details we need to store in state. One is cart items, another one is count. You can store total amount of that cart items. We can update the total amount when user is adding and removing the items. You can do anything. So what is a slicer? Actually, what is the size slicer? What is the purpose of slicer? Slicer is nothing but actually in Redux, slicer is used to configure the initial state. It is used to configure the initial state and actions. Initial state and actions are defined in a slicer. That means you need to create a slicer. By using the slicer, you can define the initial state. Actually, initial state means what? We need cart items. Cart items is an any type array. Any type array. It is an empty array as of now. And another one is nothing but, so you can have cart count, am I right? Cart count is what type? Number. and initially it is 0. And you have action. What is the action? Add to cart. Add to cart. Add to cart is an any type, because actually it is going to be a function, right? Add to cart is going to be a function method, right? That means you need to configure the type as in. So usually, what is a slicer in Redux? The purpose of slicer in Redux is to configure the initial state. You have to configure the initial state. What the items you want to store in the state. In the state container, what you want to store. You can configure all of them here. And what are the actions you need to manage? Those actions you can configure. Okay. That is what slicer is. And how to create slicer? Actually, slicer is created by importing a create slicer. Actually, you have to import create slicer. You have to import this create slicer from Redux toolkit. From Redux toolkit, you will find a slicer. And because remember, without slicer also people use, but it is good to follow the standards. That means without slicer, what they do is directly they configure an initial state. So they configure the initial state at component level itself, and they will manage it, right? But better at high level, you use a slicer where you configure all the initial states. So for that, what you have to do is you need to create one file, right? You need to create a file. I will give you the logic, you do it. So you need to create a slicer. This is the slicer. Create slicer.tsx. You have to create a file. So add a new file into project. This already our people of other batches have done. I'm just giving you that code. You try, because this is, you need to practice. You need to do by yourself, because already we have done these projects. And in that you have to just add this concept, because you already used reducer also, right? So we have to create this file name. I will give, what is the file name? Create cart slicer, cart slicer, cart slicer.tsx. What is the cart slicer? So in that slicer, you have to add this code. That means what you have to do, we have to import create slice. From which one? Redux toolkit. We need initial state with 2 details. What are those details? Cart items and cart count, right? Better use the types. What is the type? It is an any type, na? It is any type array. And this is number. You configure that. This is just an object, so you need to mention the data type. It is just an object, right? And we have to create a cart slice. You see, in this cart slice, create slice, its name is cart. That means you can access this by name cart. And what is the initial state? Reducer. Reducer is nothing but add to cart. Add to cart is using state and action. We already done that in reducer. In reducer also, I given which one we used, counter, right? So likes, dislikes, I showed you that example. Like that means we have like button. We have 2 things, state and then action. That means when add to cart is clicked, that means we are expecting a method called add to cart. Add to cart is going to collect the data and define the action. That means what we are doing, payload. Action will collect the payload. What is the payload? Payload is product details. The product details will come and they will be pushed into which array? Cart items array. That means in the state, we will create cart items array. Into the cart items array, we will push the details. What are the details to be pushed? Payload. Payload contains what? Product details. Product details we have to collect and we have to push. And we need to update the cart count. Cart count is coming from cart items dot length. We have to do this. That means a slice is used to configure the initial state. That means here we define two things. When user click add to cart button, we are collecting the product details payload, am I right? And we are sending these product details into cart items. Understood? Initial state contains two details now, cart items and cart count. And according to the items in the cart, we will update that into the count. Its length we will access and we can update that into the count. This is initial state we call as slice. That means create slice is nothing but it is used to configure the initial state of your application. Initial state. Without this also, majority, when you see Redux examples, majority will go with slice, because their intention is just to make you understand about you have some data and push the data into store. That is only the example you will see. But before the data goes, what should be the data that you have to mention? That is mentioned by using what? Slice, right? You create a slice, you configure the slice and you define it, right? After you define, now what should happen is, this is the action. Why the action is defined as reducer? Already we learned reducer is responsible for identifying the changes. It will update the changes. That means we have to export these actions, whatever actions you defined inside the reducer. Cart slice have actions. These are actions. Na? What is the action? Action is add to cart. That means you have to collect that add to cart and export, so that you can use this add to cart on button click. Add to cart on button click. Understood? And what is the cart slice? Cart slice dot reducer. That means this reducer is exported, so that you can access this reducer by using the reference of cart slice, right? Remember, this is not new concept. Already we learnt it. The same approach I told you in use reducer, right? So if you forgot, once go through that again. We already discussed this approach. That is the reason I'm not writing again. I'm just explaining the process. You have to do it, right? So if you feel difficulty, I will show you, right? If you feel difficulty in managing that, I will show you, no problem. Okay, but you have to do this. This is the slicer ready. What is the purpose of slicer? In the slicer, we define what is the initial state and what are the actions and what is the payload. We need to configure all these details. So what are the data to be stored? Cart items and cart items count. What is the action? Add to cart. And what is the reducer? Reducer add to cart. Actions na? And what is the payload? Payload is nothing but product details. Product details we have to send. When to send the product details? When user clicks on add to cart. Why add to cart is given as a reducer? Add to cart is given as a reducer because it identifies the changes when you click add to cart button, and it will update those changes. Already some data is there. Once you click again, then it will add the new details. This is what you have to do in the slicer. That means a slice contains slice name. It contains initial state. Initial state contains cart items and cart count. It contains reducers. That means a slice contains three details. Slice name. This is used to access the slice and use in your component. It contains slice name and it contains initial values to be stored, and it contains the actions to perform. Understood? Slice contains three details. I will just give you an overview here. That means slice comprises of three things. One is initial state. Understood? It contains a name and it contains reducer. Reducer defines actions. Understood? Reducer defines what actions to perform. These three things are defined in the slice. Okay. Now, after you configure the slice, this is step 2. First step, you install. Second step, you create a slice. You configure the slice. After creating the slice, step 3. That means you have to implement this now. In the step 3, you have to implement this. You created a slice. You have to use this in your UI. You have to use this in your UI. That means what data to store, where to store, you have to configure everything. That means the next step here I will give you, after creating the slice, you have to create the store. This is what you have to define. Step 3 is configure store. Configure store. Remember, store is not ready yet. You just mentioned what should be the values to be stored in store. Store is not created. You have to configure the store. So first step, what you have done, installed. Second step, what you have done, you mentioned what should be the initial values. But where these initial values are stored, where these actions are managed, they are managed and stored in a store. That store need to be configured. That means you have to configure the store. We have to add a file here, store.tsx. You have to add a file, store.tsx. In that store.tsx, this is the logic. Here, what you have to do, you have to import configure store. You have to import slicer. Slicer contains initial state. It contains initial state. Now, in the configure store, what we have to do is, we have to use the reducer. You have to access, configure the reducer. It contains a store. It accesses the cart slicer. Cart slicer means it contains two things. What it contains? It contains initial state. Am I right? It contains actions. Now, initial state and actions you can access with the reference of store. That means what is the initial state? Initial state contains cart items and it contains count. Cart items and count. So now everything is defined inside the store. So configure store, what it is responsible for? It is responsible for creating a store, and in the store it will manage these details. What are the details? Whatever the details you mentioned in slicer. What many people do is they directly do this. Understood? That means in many of Redux practical examples, when you see, majority people, what they do is directly they start from configuring a store. Understood? In the configuring store, what they do here in the store, they define initial values. They will define the reducer actions. They configure everything here. But we haven't done that. We done a clean separation. What we done? Initial state and initial actions we mentioned in a slicer, and that slicer we are using in store. Majority of Redux, they will give you directly configuring the store. They will give you directly configuring the store. So it is always good, use a clean separation hierarchy. Use a clean separation hierarchy. Okay, na? So you have to define this. This is enough. That means your store is ready. That means what it is responsible for. It is responsible for. It creates a store centralized. Am I right? It creates a store centralized and adds the references. The references for whom? Two references. One is cart items array. Another reference for cart count. It will add references for that, so that whatever values you entered into them, they will be stored. That means now store contains these two things. Store contains these two things. That is the third step. Okay, now the step 3 is done. You configured the store. Actually, store contains information about the store name and what are the values it is going to store. Instead of directly mentioning them, we created a slicer and assigned the slicer to the store. Understood? We created a slicer and assigned the slicer. So the cart slicer is using that, right? That is what actually the option. Understood? Okay. Now after this, next step 4. What is the step 4? Step 4, now you need to use this actions and store. You need to configure and use these actions and store in your component. That means you have to, already we done this process. You see, what is the process we have to do? These steps we have done. Huh? Yeah. In this, what we have done, we defined actions. We defined the reducer. Am I right? And we configured the store and we defined the state also. Now we need to attach this to the UI. You have to attach this to the UI. That means state contains cart items and cart items count. Now we need to attach this, the actions and everything we need to configure there. So what to do now? So in order to do that, you have to configure UI. You have to configure the UI from where you have to manage all these actions. For that, what you do is you go to products component.tsx. Understood? Actually, this products component.tsx is nothing but your shopping cart page. Understood? This is your shopping cart page where all the products information is displayed in a card style with a button called add to cart. That means a shopping cart page with the add to cart button. Every product will be there with add to cart button. Here you have to implement that logic here. So this is the logic you have to configure. This is the logic you need to define. This is the logic you need to define. So what you have to do? You have to import add to cart. Add to cart is a reducer. Na? Add to cart is an action. Na? Action defined where? In the slicer. What that add to cart will do? Observe that in the slicer, that add to cart, it will collect the state and it will define the action. It will collect the payload and it will store into cart items. That means what you have to do here is you need to configure add to cart. And you know dispatcher already in reducer. In reducer, dispatcher is used for dispatching the actions. Dispatching the actions is done by dispatcher. Already we learned about dispatcher in reducer. Now use dispatch. Now handle add to cart button click. On add to cart button click, we have to collect the product details and we need to send the product details through whom we have to dispatch. Dispatch is used for executing the action. Am I right? Whatever actions are mentioned, those actions are executed by dispatch. Dispatch is going to execute the action. Which action? Add to cart. Add to cart have to collect the product details and send. That means this add to cart button, we have a add to cart button, handle add to cart button. What we have to do, this button have a product details. Actually, this button is present inside. If you remembered, this button is present inside a logic like this. What is the logic? It is products. Products is collection. Products dot what? Map. In that what we are doing? We are accessing every product. And for every product, if you remembered, we designed a card. Na? Am I right? For every product, we designed a card. In this card, this button will be there. Understood? In that card, this button will be there. All the product details will be there. Along with that, the button will be there. And when you click the button, what will happen? Handle add to cart button. Into that current product details will be passed. What is the current product details? It is payload. Understood? Add to cart is that means you are sending the payload. Payload is collected here. After that, the payload is passed into add to cart. That means where it will go? Dispatch will dispatch to the store. That means it will go to the slicer. Na? You see, it comes to the slicer. In the slicer, what it will do? In the slicer, it will collect the payload. What is the payload? Product. After collecting the product, it will push into the state. What is the state? Cart items. That means the product related information is stored in cart items. And its length is updated automatically and stored in cart count. So add to cart is collecting the payload. It is collecting the payload and it is pushing that into the state. Understood? That means you are collecting the payload. You are collecting the payload and you are collecting the payload and you are sending to this location. You are sending to this button click. We are collecting the payload and sending this. It will be stored in the state. What is a dispatch? Already we know that in any action need to be dispatched. For that we need a dispatch. Use reducer also we use dispatch. So dispatch is responsible for dispatching the reducer action, executing the reducer action into that sending the product details. This you have to implement in that shopping example. Now it is not finished. Why? Because one more step is there. This is the final step. That means this is the final step. Actually, what is the final step here is, the final step is your application, means here configure store for at application level, at app level. You created store, but your app is not still using this store. Understood? You created store, app is not still using the store. A store is created, in that cart items count is present, but in that still data is present, but your application is not using that store. You have to make your application use the store. How to make the application use the store? Somebody have to go into the memory and pick up that store and use it for the application. That means you learned service concept. Who is responsible for locating content in the memory and injecting them into component? Who is responsible for locating item in memory and injecting into component? Who is responsible? Provider. Remember, no? That means a provider is responsible for locating the memory and injecting into application. So you have to configure store at application level with a provider. Understood? That means what you have to do, this you have to do in the file index.tsx. In index.tsx, this is the last step you have to do. In this index.tsx, you have to first import a provider. Understood? You have to import provider from Redux. And what you have to do by using the provider, you have to configure the store. This will collect the store. That will collect the store and make it available for your iShop. We have index page now, where we are displaying all the details. That means it is available for that location. That means you have to import store from store. That store is nothing but store.tsx file. Na? Store.tsx file is having the store. You have to import from there. And you have to use a provider to use your store. If you don't mention this, your application cannot use the store. Whatever store you configured, it will be used by your application. Right? This is the concept you have to implement. Now, I need to see practically how many of you are capable of doing this. I will give this now. You have to design this with TypeScript application. If you are feeling difficulty in that, I will upload complete designed example into Classroom. But first I need to see by tomorrow how many of you can try this. If you are feeling difficulty, I will show you. I will help you in that, right? If you are feeling difficulty, but because already we know all this concept using a reducer, here additionally you have to learn these points. So what are the steps? First, create a slice. After that, configure the store. After that, configure the store. and after that reducer and inject into your application. These are the things you have to follow. Try this, right? Designing in a shopping cart example, right? Now, if you, I will upload an example already. I will upload one example which is already implemented with this. You can just try that example, but you have to know where which option is configured. If you can do this by yourself, that is very good. If you take help of that example and try, still it is okay, right? Because you need to understand the logic behind this. So like this, you can store any data which is required across application. Not only cart items, not only cart items count, total count, or user related details. Suppose when user logged in, his profile need to be stored. We need to maintain and access everywhere in that you can do by using these kind of things, right? You try this. If you have any difficulty, we will see, right? Then with the next concept, I will show you how to use React, how to use React Native, and how to use frameworks like Ionic. This is nothing but developing applications for mobile. That means how React is used in building mobile apps. I will give a simple example, right? Just introduction. We are not learning mobile development. Just I will give an introduction. We call them as PWA. Till now we have seen SPA. SPA is single page application. Those are called PWA, progressive web application. Progressive web application means mobile compatible. That means Android, iOS based. That we will see. One example I will show you. Just introduction. I will not go into mobile development, but I will give you introduction because people who are learning mobile development, React is used there also. And they need to know how, right? For that, we will see one simple approach, right? Tomorrow we will see how to use this React Native and React Ionic. But first I will once verify your example. Have you able to do this or not? Otherwise, I will explain one more time. Okay, na? Right? Tomorrow I will continue then. Right?